Welcome back to the commentary team. And my phone has just beeped when it shouldn't have done. So we're going to start by talking, having some observations about Derek's, if I must say, extraordinary, erudite and detailed and thought-provoking presentation. And then we're going to talk more about the issues around LMIC and tobacco harm reduction. I just wanted to make a couple of opening comments myself. The title was, why has the FCTC failed to reduce adult smoking and attendant health deficits? And it needs to probably be borne in mind that the strategy, the convention implementation strategy, is this thing called Empower. And the letters stand for different aspects of tobacco control. And the O in Empower stands for offering help. Now, by the WHO's own admission, it's that bit of Empower which has pretty much failed dismally, to the extent that it's, by its own admission, 70% of countries, people, smokers across the world, have no access at all to cessation services. And where these services do exist, in many countries, there's no government funding to allow people to attend them, so they have to find the money themselves, in consequence of which, of course, they don't. And in fact, a recent report from the Framework Convention Alliance, which is the group of NGOs that get the kind of royal seal of approval from the FCTC Secretariat, who apparently contain mavericks, according to Derek. I'm really very fascinated to find out about FCTC mavericks. Who these people are and what do they look like? But anyway, according to this FCA report, to get to what they call the highest level of achievement across all the elements of Empower is going to cost something like approaching $28 billion. And that's only going to come from donations from the countries that are signed up to the convention. And you can't imagine that's going to happen anytime soon, particularly with the fallout on national economies from the pandemic. So we have a situation with smoking rates in many countries either rising or plateauing and have hardly changed. So without getting too much into kind of conspiracy theory, it does feel as if this attack, renewed attack really, on the industry and on the science of new nicotine products and the ad hominem attacks and all the rest of it, could be viewed as simply a deflection away from the fact that standard international tobacco control measures have failed, and that, again, using WHO figures, we're still in a position where a billion lives will be lost by the end of the century. So that might be something worth thinking about. So I'm going to ask Sarah, because she's got some kind of reflections on what Derek had to say this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, there's so much I liked about Derek's talk, but one of the things that sort of sticks in my mind is that, you know, a technological revolution requires an ideological revolution. And what's also happening is, of course, is that the technological revolution is driving a people revolution. So the people that are joining the tobacco industry and willing to join the tobacco industry in the last few years are very different people. You're bringing in people from the pharmaceutical industry, people who are specialists in formulation, people who are specialists in batteries, all sorts of people who never would have dreamed of coming to work for the tobacco industry. And I think that you know, another thing that people say is that many of the people now in the industry weren't even born when the tobacco wars were at their greatest height. And I think what we want is to be judged for the actions of today, not the actions of the past. And so I found Derek's talk so heartening in so many different ways. And that was one thing that really stuck out for me. And I think also that the fact that the FDA cannot cannot and will not ignore the data. And so I do think that science will prevail. I really agree that eventually science will prevail. It has to. It just has to.
Yes, come on.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that, because it was once described to me that industry moving from selling cigarettes to selling, say, an e-cigarette is like having a company go from selling a bag of spuds to an iPad, you know, because of the difference in technology between the two products. You know, for 100 years, they've just been selling dried leaves in a tube. And then all of a sudden, like you said, battery strength comes into it, and design and everything else. So, it is a bit of a transformation. I was heartened by Derek and Cliff talking, especially when it came to, as you said, you know, inevitably the evidence is going to win over in the end. And it's nice, you know, when you talk about the WHO, normally it's quite depressing to talk about what they're getting up to, but it was quite a positive message. I'd also like to pick up on what Derek said about the FCTC wording itself, because it's important to note that all the elements are in there to have a sensible policy towards harm reduction. Harm reduction, Article 1D of the preamble talks about harm reduction, and there's things in there about human rights and everything else. So it doesn't actually need to be rewritten. It's just that those parts of the FCTC need to be adhered to and highlighted to policymakers. They wouldn't be going against their principles if they swiveled around and started supporting harm reduction.
Well, no, and I think it's a really interesting point that Derek made there, that Derek was one of the architects of the FCTC. I mean, he was there right at the get-go. And they were talking to industry at a point when industry was trying to bring out, I assume they're talking about, you know, light cigarettes and all of that kind of thing, which we all know kind of didn't really deliver on the promise. But not only did they put harm reduction in there, in the hope and understanding that these products would come along. But the other bit in that preamble is that they will keep a watchful eye on current evidence, scientific and clinical evidence, and develop the FCTC in accordance with changing technologies and evidence, and they clearly didn't. And this was, it was enacted in 2005 when there weren't any products like that on the market apart from snus and smokeless. But
they're also going against some of their scientific advisors who are coming out with rather positive messages. And it's almost like the people at the top in FCTC are not listening to their own people, you know.
Well, yeah, and again, from what Derek said, that there are elements within the FCTC that are kind of embedded, whatever the right word is. They're stuck in a time warp of being unavailable, being not willing to engage with industry at any level. And of course, again, this idea of something that's totally irrevocable, to find any meeting point between industry and public health, again, was at a time when there were no technological developments. There were no e-cigarettes. There were no heated tobacco products. All you could look at that point, really, in terms of mass market, was cigarettes. And it may be reasonable to say that at the point when there was only cigarettes, there may well have been an irreconcilable gulf between public health but clearly that is now redundant, or should be redundant. And sadly, it doesn't seem to be.
That actually reminds me of a talk at the GFN a few years ago by Michael Hufford, when he was talking about the innovation S-curve. And so when you look at an industry and how its maturity in terms of innovation, you use this S-curve. So like computer chips and stuff are at the top of the S-curve, and any advances are really incremental. But for nicotine delivery, we're just at the bottom of the S-curve. And so that fact that came out in Derek's talk about the second largest number of patents being registered for alternative nicotine products, that really shows that we're moving along the S-curve. And the warning that Michael Hufford gave a few years ago was it's so important for governments not to inadvertently stifle innovation, because it's innovation and science that's going to bring us the next generation and the next wave of products that can really help shift smokers that really compete with a cigarette and shift smokers off. Innovation and science, back to this, are key.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that statistic on the number,
Yeah.
of, you know, like after artificial intelligence,
Yes, amazing.
the number of patents for new products. And it would be fascinating to, I mean, I don't intend to dive into the databases to try and find out, but it would be very interesting to find out what the where these patents are taking us in terms of new products. And it sounds almost like infinite, really, the number of products you might be able to tweak and serve specific markets, specific consumers with certain requirements. Fascinating stuff. If we can kind of move on to the LMIC issues. Again, I mean, I think there are sort of four things that kind of came to mind while I was listening to people speaking. First was this issue of what can the tobacco, what can the industry do to help this process, and we'll come on to that in a minute. I think we probably all agree on a kind of over-reliance on the WHO to provide the information for health ministries. And I think that to be fair, what health ministries often struggle with, particularly in the poorest countries, where you might have endemic infectious diseases, that not only have they got that to deal with, but they also don't have the health infrastructures in order to properly evaluate independently some of the information that's coming through, which is where the kind of invidious Western-backed philanthropic, and I use the word advisedly in this context, funding is really helping to, and it's almost like old tobacco style playbook. You know, even now you get WHO and its kind of allies talking about tobacco company interference and undermining of public health and tobacco control. And what a lot of this funding, philanthropic funding, is doing is exactly that. To the extent that politicians in the Philippines were incredibly concerned that Bloomberg money was coming into their own FDA and influencing their policies. So, you know, even countries in this region whose health agencies might feel they need this money because it's not coming from anywhere else, are beginning to wake up to the iniquities in what's happening in the attempt to basically to subvert the best interests of public health in order to follow a particular agenda. And I suppose the other thing around this, I'm not actually sure whether this came up, and I might have missed it, it's just the prevalence of state-owned tobacco companies in these regions, particularly in Asia, Far East, Southeast Asia, where you have, I mean, China and India have got the two biggest tobacco companies in the world, and other countries where you have either 100% tobacco monopoly, or at least a high level of engagement, stakeholdership of the government in the tobacco company. You kind of get the sense that, well, there you go. Why would they try and undermine their own industry by allowing these, you know, these new products in? So, taxation and business and finance and who knows what else seems to override the public health interest in a number of these countries. So, as we have an industry representative in our midst, I'd just like to turn to Sarah to talk about this whole issue of appropriate, affordable products and all of that. And I know you've got at least one specific example of how this has played out.
I mean, I think as a backdrop, we do approach every country in a similar way. So I think the one I wanted to talk about was in sort of trying to identify products that make sense in a market. I was involved in the launch of the oral nicotine pouches in Uzbekistan, and when I was doing the research to prepare for that trip, I discovered Nazvi, like Natalia was talking about. And I had never heard of it before, but it suddenly made sense as to why Uzbekistan was chosen as an early market to launch the nicotine pouches because there is a culture of using oral tobacco products, and therefore it should be familiar for people to sort of switch from NASVI to a nicotine pouch. Whereas in other markets, it wouldn't make sense. If there's no culture of using a certain type of product, it's not going to work. You're going to have, like, launching snus in Canada didn't work because there's really no culture of using those sorts of products. Right. So you do have to kind of figure out what is going to make sense in a particular country.
Right.
And Japan and heated tobacco products, I think that's a really astonishing story.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about the Swedish experience, but now increasingly there's the Japanese experience. Right. And if you look at how quickly the Japanese market has shifted from combustible cigarette sticks to sticks for heated tobacco products in just 4 or 5 years, it's remarkable. You know, you're 35+%.
There's kind of various theories as to why the country's smokers have kind of adopted heated tobacco products. I'm not sure anyone's come up with a definitive answer, but there may be analysis within the industry that's pinpointed some reasons why they think it's taken off.
It helps that e-cigarettes are banned in Japan and Korea, I think. But yeah, it's definitely it's the different products work in different markets. So your Nordic countries have got the snus, which is working well for them, and Japan and Korea. I mean, Korea, I think, has got a nationalised tobacco industry, but they saw their market being absolutely decimated by Philip Morris coming in with IQOS, and then they've had to develop their own heated tobacco products. Whereas you look at places like India and Thailand, which have got nationalised industries, they probably saw that happening and thought, you know what, we don't want to develop anything new, we'll just ban them. You know, call me a cynic, but I think the fact that they have these nationalised industries and the fact they banned e-cigarettes outright, they kind of seem to be linked.
Well, yeah, exactly a coincidence. But no, I mean, I am interested in what's been going on in Japan, and it has been quite ignored, really. But I mean, you could argue, okay, so they banned e-cigarettes, but that doesn't automatically mean that your cigarette sales are going to fall by about 30 or 35% in about 3 or 4 years, because so there was obviously a demand within that country for those products, and the fact that the Japanese government chose to allow this to happen. You are allowed to advertise and market and distribute it, I think is fairly indicative of what happens in all regions of, you know, everywhere, but particularly where you've got a region of the world, LMIC countries, where you have 80% of smokers and around half of all deaths. That if the regulatory regime allows these things to happen, and you've got the right product in the right place at the right time with the right price and all the rights tick tick tick, as seems to have happened with mobile phones. I mean, mobile phones, for example, ubiquitous across Africa. Everyone sees a mobile phone. So you can make these products available. You get take-up.
Well, and I think the Japanese experience is really interesting because, like Martin says, electronic cigarettes are essentially banned because nicotine is considered a medicine. So to have vaping products, you have to go through a medicines license. Japan is a culture that is really, really interested in technology and gadgets. It's a country that is very, very, they care a great deal about each other. And so consideration for others is also a really important aspect. And I think that, so the combination of being interested in technology, smokers who wanted to try something else, there really was only one option, right? Heated tobacco products. And when they started to be launched, you would have people queuing up around the shops, to get into them and to get their hands on these new exciting devices.
I think the other aspect to it, which I'm not quite sure how this maybe it what's the word, builds on this idea of them allowing these products, is, from what I understand, Japan, perhaps surprisingly from what you say, has been a little bit slow on the uptake in terms of general tobacco control measures in the country, in terms of public smoking. I mean, there was some controversy, I think, about what the Olympics would have happened in 2020, and there were only a few cities where there were public smoking bans and things. So they weren't necessarily wedded to the idea of banning everything and controlling everything from a combustible tobacco point of view. But there's no doubt that consumers in that country, for all the reasons you've said, I mean, somebody told me that a lot of smokers in Japan actually take an ashtray out with them so that they don't drop litter on the floor. Yeah, which sounds so perfectly feasible, really.
I think what it shows as well is what we were talking about how the right product in the right market. It's Japan just seems to go for. I have to tell people in this country often that there are other products out there, because obviously in Europe and especially in the UK, e-cigarettes have taken off and are a massive success story. Yeah. But you've got heated tobacco as a success story in Japan and South Korea, and you've got Nordic countries, as I said, we've got snus and things like that. And I was interested when Joseph Magaro said about how, given a choice, what would be the product that he thinks would work in Africa. And he said nicotine pouches. Now, I've always thought that would work well, because in some of these poorer countries, you've got people who probably don't want to shell out for a piece of upfront kit, just on the off chance it might work. Whereas nicotine pouches are just a product, you just buy them and use them. Years ago when they talked about the clockwork radio and things like that, you have charging issues in many of these countries, whereas you don't need to charge a nicotine pouch. Simple. Yeah.
The other thing which is kind of, South Korea really embraced the heated tobacco product. But my understanding is that the Korean government has got itself into a position where it's beginning to start trying to use the propaganda that we all know and condemn about the evils of e-cigarettes and all the rest of it. And not only is it beginning to turn some of the population against the new nicotine products, but I also understand that their national tobacco company, which you spoke about, is beginning to find ways of making combustible cigarettes more acceptable. And they're coming up with new innovations in combustibles. I think it's called KTI. I can't remember exactly which the Korean tobacco company is. Flavored cigarettes and all of this kind of stuff. So they're beginning to think, taking the playbook from new nicotine, novel nicotine products, and applying it to a product that is not coming under the same kind of attacks that safer nicotine products are, which is a bit scary because if novel products are beginning to take away from the cigarette market, then there are going to be some cigarette markets companies that are going to be looking for ways of getting people back.
Well, it was also shocking when Natalia was talking about. I mean, we sort of gasped in here, didn't we, when she said about that Vital Strategies were putting up adverts saying e-cigarettes are equal to tobacco in the Russian Federation, was it?
Yeah.
I mean, you just think that's just flat out lying. And if it's getting to that point, how is that behaviour being tolerated when it just seems to be from a completely ideological position?
Well, but I think there are. I mean, to use a completely different analogy, there are some very dodgy groups that go into schools in this country offering free drug education. And the schools go, yeah, fine, come and tell the kids how evil drugs are and all the rest of it, because it's not costing them anything. They can tick a box and it's not costing them anything. And I think probably to some extent the same kind of thing happens. Again, in countries that don't have much money to spend on public health, here's someone coming in. Don't worry, we'll sort your public health campaign out. We'll get people not to smoke and use these evil products. Oh, fine, go ahead. Stick your posters up. Run your TV campaigns. It's not costing us any money. Knock yourself out.
Also, you find that increasingly now they're going. Tobacco control has always gone increasingly to lobbying governments, but now they seem to be getting more aggressive. And with Bloomberg money, they're going in and like in the Philippines, actually going in and trying to buy the government,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's very difficult for, say, if you're a consumer advocate like Joseph and others like that, because they've then got to try and go straight to the government themselves, and often it's very difficult for small, very poorly funded groups to be able to put together something that can go to the government to try and counter what's coming in from the other side.
That's absolutely right. I've got a feeling somebody should be waving at me to kind of. Is anyone left in the room? Are they all gone? Hello. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Okay, I got that right. A person with arm waving capacity has not emerged, but I think it is time for me to wind this up and to encourage people to go and have a look at all the wonderful videos that have been submitted while you have your lunch, breakfast or dinner, wherever you are in the world, and we will see you later on the main stage, so I'm reliably informed. So do enjoy the videos and the afternoon sessions. Thank you very much.